The carriage struck a stone in the road, and Seraphina Ashworth was thrown hard against the window, her breath catching as the wheels groaned beneath her. Outside, the sky over Crowmoor had turned the color of a bruise, and thunder rolled somewhere past the hills, like a warning she had no way to answer. She pressed her hand flat against the glass and watched the gates of Crowmoor Hall rise out of the mist, tall and black and closed, as though the house itself did not want her there. She had left home 3 days ago with a single trunk, a folded letter sealed with her father's ring, and no real understanding of what waited for her at the end of the road. Her father had told her almost nothing. He had only said that a promise made long before she was born now had to be honored, and that she was the one who must honor it. When she had asked him why, he had turned his face to the fire and said nothing at all, which frightened her more than any answer could have. The gates opened without a sound, as if someone had been standing behind them, waiting. The carriage rolled through, and gravel crunched beneath the wheels like teeth grinding in the dark. Seraphina straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her traveling dress, and told herself, for perhaps the 100th time since leaving home, that she was not afraid. She was lying to herself, and she knew it. But the lie held her together, and that was enough for now. The house came into view slowly, the way a storm comes into view, growing larger and darker the closer one gets. Crowmoor Hall was not beautiful in the soft way of the manor she had grown up in. It was severe, its stone walls gray and unyielding, its windows tall and narrow, like eyes that had learned not to blink. Ivy climbed one wing of the house and had been left to grow wild, strangling the old brick beneath it. Somewhere behind those windows, she thought, a man was waiting who had agreed, for reasons she did not understand, to marry a woman he had never met. The carriage stopped. For a long moment, Seraphina did not move. She could hear her own heartbeat, quick and unsteady, and she pressed her gloved hands together in her lap until the trembling stopped. Then the door was opened from the outside, by a footman in dark livery, his face carefully blank, and she had no choice but to step down into the wet gravel and face whatever waited for her. A woman stood at the top of the stone steps, older, dressed in gray, with a ring of keys at her waist and an expression that gave away nothing. This was Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, though Seraphina did not yet know her name. She descended the steps with slow, measured steps, as though she had all the time in the world, and stopped a few feet from the carriage. "Lady Ashworth," the woman said. It was not a question. "Yes." Seraphina's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I am expected." "You are." The housekeeper's eyes moved over her once, quickly, taking in the travel dust on her hem, the tightness around her mouth, the way her hands would not quite stay still. Whatever judgment she made, she kept it to herself. "His Grace is waiting in the east study, if you will follow me." Seraphina followed her up the steps and through the great front doors, into a hall so large her footsteps echoed against the stone floor. Portraits lined the walls, generations of Ashfields staring down at her with painted eyes, and she felt, absurdly, as though she were being judged by the dead as well as the living. The air inside the house was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer evening, and it smelled faintly of old wood and something else she could not name. Something like sorrow that had settled into the walls and never quite left. They passed a long gallery, its curtains drawn against the coming storm, and a staircase that curved up into shadow. Nowhere did she see another living soul. No sound of servants at work, no distant laughter, nothing but silence pressing in from every side. It was the silence, more than the size of the house or the coldness of the air, that unsettled her most. A house this size should have been full of noise. Instead, it felt as though it were holding its breath. Mrs. Whitfield stopped before a heavy oak door and knocked twice, then opened it without waiting for a reply. "Lady Ashworth, Your Grace." Seraphina stepped into the room, and for the first time since she had left her father's house, she found herself entirely unable to speak. The Duke of Crowmoor stood near the window with his back to her, one hand resting on the frame, looking out at the storm gathering over his land. He was tall, broader than she had expected, dressed simply in dark clothes that seemed chosen for comfort rather than display. When he turned to face her, she saw a man perhaps 10 years her senior, with a face that might once have been open and easy, but which now held itself very still, as though stillness were a habit learned through long practice. His eyes were dark and unreadable, and they studied her with an intensity that made her want to step back toward the door. "Lady Ashworth," he said. His voice was low, quiet, without warmth but without cruelty either. "You made good time, given the weather. The roads were kind to us, Your Grace, until the last hour." She curtsied, because it seemed the correct thing to do, though her legs did not entirely trust themselves to hold the position. "I have come as my father asked. I know why you have come." He moved away from the window, crossing the room slowly, and gestured toward a chair near the cold hearth. "Please, sit, if you wish it. I imagine the journey has left you tired." She did not sit. She remained standing, her hands folded before her, because sitting felt like surrender, and she was not yet ready to surrender anything, not until she understood what was being asked of her. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but I would rather understand the situation before I make myself comfortable in it." She lifted her chin slightly, drawing on whatever courage she had left after 3 days of travel and a lifetime of being told what to do. "My father sent word only days ago. He told me a promise had been made, long before I was born, and that I was now bound to see it fulfilled. He did not tell me what the promise was, or why it concerns me, or why a man I have never met should have any claim upon my future." Something shifted in the Duke's expression, so briefly she almost missed it. It might have been surprise. It might have been something closer to respect. "Your father did not tell you. It was not quite a question." "No. Then I suppose it falls to me." He clasped his hands behind his back, the posture of a man preparing to deliver news he had rehearsed many times in his own mind, but had never expected to speak aloud. "Many years ago, your father and mine were close friends. Closer, perhaps, than most men manage to be in a lifetime. When my father was dying, your father made him a promise. He said that if ever the Ashfield line required a wife to secure its future, his own daughter, whenever she was born, would be offered freely, without condition, without complaint. My father held that promise close for the rest of his life. He passed it to me before he died as well, though I confess I did not expect to call upon it." Serafina felt something cold settle in her chest. "And now you have." "Now I have." He said it plainly, without apology, as though he expected her anger, and had already decided he would not flinch from it. "My father said you required a wife." The silence stretched between them, heavy and strange. Serafina waited for him to soften the words, to explain them away, to offer some comfort that might make the sentence easier to bear. He offered nothing of the kind. "He was right," the Duke said. For a moment, Serafina could not find her voice at all. She had expected apology, perhaps even reluctance, some acknowledgement that this arrangement was as strange and unwelcome to him as it was to her. Instead, she had been given 3 words, spoken with the calm certainty of a man discussing the weather, and those 3 words seemed to close a door somewhere behind her that she had not even realized was still open. "You say that as though it settles the matter," she said, and to her own surprise, there was heat in her voice now, where moments before, there had only been fear. "As though I am a debt to be collected, rather than a person to be considered. That is not my meaning." For the first time, something like discomfort crossed his face, quickly hidden again, beneath that careful stillness. "I only meant that my father saw clearly what I did not wish to see myself. This house has been without a mistress for 3 years. My tenants have begun to whisper that the Crowmoor line will end with me, out of spite as much as sorrow. My aunt writes weekly to remind me of my duty. I have ignored all of it, because I did not wish to marry again, not after." He stopped himself, the sentence unfinished, and looked away from her toward the dead fireplace. "Not after what, Your Grace? That is not a conversation for tonight." His voice had gone quieter still, and something in it made her decide, for now, not to press. "What I mean to say, Lady Ashworth, is this. My father was right that I required a wife. He was not necessarily right that it should be you, specifically, over any other woman in England. That much I do not yet know. But the debt is real, and your father believes it must be honored, and you have traveled here in good faith to see whether it can be. I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not insult you by pretending this is anything other than what it is." Serafina studied him for a long moment, this tall, guarded stranger, who spoke of his own marriage as though it were a ledger to be balanced. She did not know whether to admire his honesty or resent it. Perhaps both were true at once. "And what is it, precisely, that you imagine this to be?" an arrangement. He met her eyes directly, and there was something in his gaze that was not quite cold, though it was not warm either, one that could serve us both, if we allow it the chance. You would have a title, a household of your own, protection your father cannot always provide from where he stands. I would have an heir, and peace from those who circle this house waiting for me to fail at my duty. Beyond that, I ask nothing of you that you are not willing to give. And if I am not willing to give any of it, then you may return to your father's house tomorrow, and I will find some other way to satisfy the debt, and no shame will fall on your name for having come and considered it. He said this without hesitation, as though he had prepared for the possibility that she would refuse him outright, and had made his peace with it before she ever arrived. I will not force you into a marriage you do not choose, Lady Ashworth. Whatever my father's promise or your father's honor, that much at least, I owe you. It was not the answer she had expected. She had braced herself, on the long ride to Crowmoor, for coldness, for demand, perhaps even for cruelty, dressed up as duty. Instead, she found a man who seemed as trapped by the situation as she was, offering her a door she had not known was open, even as he stood inside a house that felt, to her, like something between a fortress and a tomb. Thunder cracked outside, closer now, and rain began to strike the tall windows in sudden, heavy sheets. Neither of them moved. The fire had not been lit, and the room held the particular chill of a place that had grown used to being cold, the way a heart grows used to being guarded. I will need time, Serafina said finally, before I can give you an answer. You shall have it. He inclined his head, a small, formal gesture that somehow felt more genuine than any bow he might have offered a stranger at court. Mrs. Whitfield will show you to your rooms. Stay as long as you require, to consider what has been asked of you. No one in this house will trouble you, and no one will judge whatever answer you reach. And you, your grace, will you not judge me for it? For the briefest moment, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. I have very little room left in me to judge anyone, Lady Ashworth. Least of all a woman who has been asked to pay a debt she never agreed to owe. She left the study a few minutes later, following Mrs. Whitfield up the wide staircase, and along a corridor lined with more silent portraits, her mind turning over every word the Duke had spoken. 3 words kept returning to her above all the rest, simple and plain and somehow enormous. He was right. She did not yet know what it would cost her to learn exactly how right he had been, or how much of his own life he had left unspoken in that cold, quiet study. But as the storm broke fully over Crowmoor Hall, and rain hammered against her window long into the night, Serafina Ashworth lay awake in a strange bed, in a strange house, bound to a stranger by a promise made before she was born, and found that fear was no longer the only thing she felt. Somewhere beneath it, faint and unwelcome, was the first stirring of curiosity about the man who had spoken his father's judgment aloud without once trying to soften it, a man who had given her a door to leave through, and yet, in the same breath, had made her wonder what she might be leaving behind if she walked through it. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it finally did, it was full of stone corridors and closed doors, and a voice, low and steady, repeating 3 words over and over into the dark. He was right. He was right. He was right. She woke before dawn, to the sound of someone moving softly outside her door, and lay still, listening, wondering whether Crowmoor Hall had already begun keeping its secrets from her, or whether, in time, it might choose to share them instead. Serafina woke to gray light pressing against the curtains, and the sound of rain still falling, softer now than in the night, more like a whisper than a warning. For a moment she did not know where she was. Then the memory returned all at once. The long road, the closed gates, the cold study, and 3 words spoken without apology. He was right. She lay still for a long while, watching shadows move across the ceiling, before she found the will to rise. A maid came shortly after, a young woman with red hair and quick hands, who introduced herself as Lucy and helped Serafina dress without being asked twice for anything. Lucy did not speak much, but her eyes moved often toward the door, as though she expected someone to appear there, and was relieved each time no one did. Serafina noticed this, and filed it away with everything else she had noticed since arriving. A house full of careful silences was a house full of things left unsaid. Is breakfast taken together in this house? Serafina asked. Or does His Grace prefer to dine alone? His Grace takes breakfast in the small parlor most mornings, my lady. Lucy's hands paused briefly over the laces of Serafina's dress. Alone, mostly. He has done so a long while now. And before that? Lucy's fingers resumed their work, faster than before. Before that, my lady, he did not dine alone at all. She said nothing further, and Serafina did not press her, though the words settled into her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples she could not yet trace to their source. She found her way down to the small parlor without assistance, following the scent of tea and the sound of a single set of cutlery moving against porcelain. The Duke sat at the head of a table meant for a dozen, alone, a newspaper folded beside his plate, untouched. He rose the moment she entered, a gesture of courtesy that seemed almost out of place in a house that had otherwise abandoned every softness. Lady Ashworth, I did not expect you so early. I did not expect to sleep at all, given the circumstances, and yet I did. She took the seat a servant offered her, near enough to the Duke that conversation would not require raised voices, far enough that the distance between them still felt deliberate. I thought I might see more of the house today, if that is permitted. It is difficult to consider a future in a place I do not yet understand. Something in his expression shifted, and for the first time she saw a flicker of genuine surprise cross his features. You wish to see Crowmoor. I wish to understand it. There is a difference. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away first, though every instinct urged her toward the safety of her own plate. A house this large does not fall silent by accident, Your Grace. I would like to know why this one has. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she wondered whether she had asked for something he was not prepared to give. Then he set down his cup and nodded once, slowly, as though deciding something within himself. Very well. After breakfast, I will show you the house myself. He paused, and something almost like reluctance colored his next words. Though I warn you, Lady Ashworth, not every room in Crowmoor holds an easy story. If you wish to turn back at any point, you have only to say so. I did not come this far to turn back at the first difficult door, she said, and though her voice was steady, her heart beat faster than she wished to admit. They finished the meal with little further conversation, though she noticed him watching her more than once. Quick glances he seemed to think went unnoticed. When breakfast ended, he rose and offered his arm, an old formality that felt strange between two people who barely knew each other, and yet she took it, because refusing would have felt stranger still. He led her first through the long gallery she had passed the night before, now lit by pale morning light instead of shadow. The portraits here were older, faces from generations past, stern men in old fashions, and women whose painted eyes seemed to follow her down the hall. The Duke named a few of them as they passed, his voice taking on the practiced tone of a man reciting a lesson he had learned as a child, and never quite stopped reciting since. His great-grandfather, who had built the East Wing. His grandmother, who had planted the gardens that now grew wild behind the house. Ancestors upon ancestors, watching a house that had, in recent years, given them so little to watch. At the end of the gallery, they reached a door that the Duke did not open. He stopped before it, his hand resting on the frame rather than the handle, and Serafina noticed the change in him immediately, a stillness that was different from his usual careful calm, closer to something guarded and raw. This was my wife's sitting room, he said quietly, my first wife. I have not opened it in 3 years. Serafina did not speak. She had suspected, from the whispers and the silences and the way the servants avoided certain corridors, that there had been someone before her, someone whose absence still shaped the house more than any living presence did. Hearing it confirmed so plainly still struck her with more weight than she expected. I am sorry, she said finally, because it seemed the only honest thing to say. I did not know. Few outside this house do, and I have preferred it that way. He drew his hand back from the door, as though the wood itself had grown too warm to touch. Her name was Margaret. We were married 5 years. She died in the winter, 3 years past, and I have not been the same man since, whatever appearance I managed to hold together in company. How did she die, if I may ask? His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he would refuse to answer at all. Illness, sudden and cruel, and no physician in England could stop it once it had taken hold. I was away when it happened, Attending to business in London that I have since told myself, 1,000 times over, was not worth the cost of my absence. He looked away from her, toward the far end of the gallery, as though the truth were easier to speak to empty air than to her face. I did not reach her in time to say goodbye. I have carried that failure with me every day since, and I do not expect to ever set it down. Serafina felt something in her chest tighten, an ache she had not expected to feel for a man she barely knew. That is not a failure, Your Grace. Grief has a way of making blame out of things that were never within our power to change. Perhaps. He did not sound convinced, though something in his shoulders eased slightly at her words, as though they had, at the very least, been a kindness he had not expected to receive. In any case, this room has remained closed since her death. I do not open it, and I would ask that you do not either. Not out of any wish to keep secrets from you, but because some doors are easier left shut.
I understand, and she did, more than she expected to.
She thought of her own mother, gone since Serafina was a child, and the small chest in her father's house that had never once been opened in her presence, though she had seen him sit beside it many quiet evenings, his hand resting on the lid, as though it held something too precious and too painful to disturb. They continued through the house, in silence for a time, the Duke pointing out rooms and features with less enthusiasm than before, as though the conversation at the closed door had drained something from him that would take time to restore. He showed her the library, tall shelves reaching toward a painted ceiling, and she found herself lingering there longer than anywhere else, drawn to the smell of old paper and leather bindings, the promise of 1,000 other lives contained within those pages, safer and simpler than her own. You are fond of reading, the Duke observed, watching her trail her fingers along a row of spines. It is often the only company I have chosen for myself, she admitted. My father kept a small library, nothing to rival this, but I spent more hours there than anywhere else in the house. Books do not ask anything of you that you are not willing to give. No, he agreed, and something in his voice suggested he understood the sentiment more deeply than she had intended it. They do not. They walked on, through a music room with an instrument that had clearly not been played in some time, its lid closed and dust gathering faintly along the edges, and out into a long conservatory where plants grew, in wild, untended profusion, spilling over their pots and climbing the glass walls, as though nature itself had decided to take back what neglect had left behind. This was Margaret's favorite place in the house, the Duke said quietly, standing at the threshold rather than stepping inside. She kept it beautifully. I have not had the heart to bring anyone in to manage it since. Serafina looked at the wild green chaos before her, and rather than seeing neglect, she saw something else entirely, a kind of stubborn, persistent life that had refused to stop growing, even without care, even in a house that seemed determined to hold its breath forever. It is not ruined, she said softly. It has simply grown in its own direction, without anyone to guide it. That is not the same as being lost. He looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way he had not quite managed since she arrived, as though her words had struck something in him he had not expected a stranger to reach. You have a talent, Lady Ashworth, for finding meaning in places I have only ever found sorrow. Perhaps that is because I am not the one who lost anything here, she said honestly. It is easier to see hope in another person's ruins than in one's own. They stood there a while longer, neither speaking, the rain finally easing outside the glass walls, pale sunlight beginning to break through the clouds and scatter across the wild green leaves in patches of gold. Serafina found herself, for the first time since arriving at Crowmoor, not entirely certain that leaving would be the wiser choice, whatever fear had brought her through those gates the night before. The tour continued through the afternoon, room by room, story by story, the Duke growing gradually more at ease as the hours passed, as though the act of showing his house to someone willing to truly look at it had loosened something in him that had been held tight for a very long time. He told her about the estate's tenants, about harvests, good and poor, about the small disputes that came to him for judgment and the ones he had learned to settle quietly before they grew into something larger. She listened more than she spoke, and found, to her surprise, that she wanted to keep listening. By the time evening fell, and they returned to the small parlor for a quiet supper, Serafina understood a great deal more about Crowmoor Hall than she had that morning, though she understood the Duke himself scarcely better than before. He remained, in many ways, as guarded as he had been the previous night, careful with his words, careful with his silences. But she had seen, in the conservatory and at the closed door of his late wife's sitting room, glimpses of a man buried beneath duty and grief, a man who had perhaps forgotten how to let anyone see him at all. That night, before retiring, she stood at her window and looked out over the dark grounds of Crowmoor, the wild garden below barely visible in the moonlight, and thought of her father's words, delivered so simply and so heavily. A promise made long before she was born, now hers alone to answer. She thought too of the Duke's own words, spoken without apology in that cold study. He was right. I did require a wife. She did not yet know what her answer would be. But she found, standing there in the quiet dark, that the question no longer frightened her quite as much as it had the night before. Something in this house, broken and beautiful and full of careful silences, had begun, however faintly, to ask something of her in return, and she was no longer entirely certain she wished to refuse it. Sleep came more easily that second night, though her dreams were filled with wild green gardens and closed doors, and a tall, quiet man standing at a window, watching a storm that had already passed. 3 days passed before Serafina found the letters, and she would later think that if she had never gone looking for a spare candle in that particular drawer of that particular writing desk, she might never have known the full shape of the man she was considering marrying. The desk stood in a small study off the library, a room the Duke rarely used, and Mrs. Whitfield had sent her there one evening to fetch paper and ink so she might write to her father. The drawer stuck when she pulled it, and when she tugged harder, it came free all at once, spilling its contents across the floor. Among the loose paper and broken sealing wax, she found a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, the parchment soft with age and handling. She should not have read them. She told herself that a dozen times, even as her fingers were already loosening the ribbon, already unfolding the first page. But curiosity, once it takes hold, rarely listens to conscience, and Serafina had spent 3 days surrounded by silences she did not understand, in a house that seemed built entirely from things left unsaid. The letters, she told herself, were simply another door, and she had promised herself she would not turn back from difficult doors. The first letter was written in a woman's hand, elegant and hurried, dated some 8 years before. It was addressed to the Duke's late father, and as Serafina read, she understood slowly that it was not a letter between friends, but between two men negotiating a marriage on behalf of their children, much as her own father had negotiated with the late Duke years before. The woman writing was Margaret's mother, and the letter spoke of dowries and settlements, and the advantages such a match would bring to both families, with scarcely a mention of the young people whose lives were being arranged. Serafina's hands trembled slightly as she read on. The second letter, and the third, told a similar story. Arrangements made and adjusted, terms debated as though love were simply another commodity, to be priced and traded. Nowhere in the correspondence did she find any suggestion that Gideon or Margaret themselves had been consulted, not truly, not in any way that mattered. They had been young, both of them, married into a bargain struck by their fathers, much as she herself was now expected to be. The final letter in the bundle was different from the rest. It was shorter, written in a man's hand she recognized now as the Duke's own, though the writing was less steady than she had seen it since her arrival. The ink blotted in places, as though the pen had paused too long before continuing. It was addressed to no one, unsent, perhaps never meant to be sent at all. I did not choose her, and she did not choose me, the letter read, and yet somehow, against every reasonable expectation, we came to love one another in truth. I do not know how such a thing happens, only that it did, slowly, over years, until I could no longer imagine my life without her in it. And now she is gone, and I am left wondering whether love that begins in obligation can ever be trusted again, or whether I was simply fortunate once, in a way I have no right to expect twice. Serafina sat very still on the floor of the small study for a long while after reading those words, the candle burning low beside her, the letters spread across her lap like fallen leaves. She thought of the Duke's face at the door of Margaret's sitting room, the careful stillness he wore like armor, the way he had spoken of failure and grief, without once excusing himself from either. She thought of his words in the cold study on her first night at Crowmoor. He was right. I did require a wife. Words that had seemed, at the time, cold and businesslike, now took on a different weight entirely, colored by everything she had just read. He had loved his first wife, deeply and truly, despite a marriage that began as nothing more than an arrangement between fathers. And he had lost her, suddenly and completely, and had spent 3 years since believing, perhaps, that such love was a fortune, given only once, never to be offered again. The arrangement he proposed to Serafina now was not, she began to understand, an act of coldness at all, but an act of a man protecting himself from ever again risking a grief so large it had closed an entire wing of his own house. She gathered the letters carefully, retied the ribbon with hands that had steadied somewhat, and returned them to the drawer exactly as she had found them, though she knew she could never again pretend she had not read them. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be set aside simply because it was not meant to be found. She did not sleep well that night, her mind turning over the letters and everything they implied, and by morning she had resolved to speak with the Duke directly, though she was not yet certain what she meant to say. She found him, as she had come to expect, in the small parlor at breakfast, the newspaper folded beside his plate, untouched as always. "Your Grace." She took her seat, folding her hands before her, rather than reaching for her own cup. "May I ask you something that may seem forward?" He set down his cup, studying her face, with the careful attention she had come to recognize as his particular habit, a way of reading a person before ever answering them. "You may ask me anything, Lady Ashworth. I cannot promise an answer, but I will not fault you for the question. Were you and your first wife happy? Truly happy, I mean, not merely bound by duty to appear so?" Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or the discomfort of a wound touched too suddenly. "That is a very direct question, I am aware. I ask it because I find I need to understand something before I can give you the answer you are waiting for, and I do not think I can reach that understanding by circling around difficult truths forever." She held his gaze, refusing to look away, though her heart beat faster than her calm voice suggested. "I know that your first marriage, like this one, began as an arrangement between your fathers. I did not learn that from gossip, and I will not pretend the manner in which I learned it was entirely proper. But I believe it matters, to both of us, whether such arrangements are capable of becoming something real." He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him decide, visibly, whether to retreat behind his usual careful distance or to answer her honestly. To her relief, he chose the latter. "Yes," he said finally, "we were happy. Not immediately, and not without difficulty in the earliest years, when we were both little more than strangers, thrown together by our father's ambitions. But in time, something grew between us that I did not expect, and could not have manufactured through effort alone. By the end, I loved her more than I had ever imagined possible, and I believe she loved me in equal measure. That is why her loss struck as deeply as it did. It is easier, I think, to bury a marriage of convenience than a marriage that became, against all odds, a true partnership of hearts." "Then you do believe it is possible," Serafina said softly, "for an arrangement such as ours to become something more than duty?" "I believe it is possible." His voice had gone quieter still, careful in a different way now, as though he were choosing each word with particular caution. "I am not certain I believe it is likely, or that I have the courage remaining in me to hope for it a second time. But I will not tell you it is impossible, because I would be lying, and I gave you my word on your first night here, that I would not insult you with false comfort." Serafina considered this, turning it over in her mind, alongside everything the letters had shown her. "Then perhaps," she said carefully, "we might agree not to force such a thing, but also not to guard against it so fiercely that it has no room to grow, should it choose to. I do not ask for your heart, your Grace. I am not certain I could bear the weight of such a gift so soon, from a man I have known only a handful of days. But I would ask that we not close every door before we have had the chance to see what might lie behind it." Something shifted in his expression then, something she had not seen before. Not quite a smile, but close to it. A softening around eyes that had spent 3 years learning to guard themselves against exactly this kind of hope. "That seems a fair request," he said, "and I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I am willing to grant it." They finished breakfast in a silence that felt different from the silences before, less guarded, more companionable, as though something unspoken had been settled between them. Some fragile agreement neither of them had quite put into words, but both understood nonetheless. When the meal ended, the Duke rose and, rather than retreating to his study as he had done the previous mornings, asked whether she might care to walk the grounds with him, now that the weather had finally cleared. Serafina accepted, and they walked together through gardens gone wild with neglect, much like the conservatory she had seen days before, nature reclaiming what grief had abandoned. The Duke spoke more freely as they walked than he had at any point since her arrival, telling her small stories of his childhood at Crowmoor, of his father's stern affection and his mother's early death, of the years before Margaret, when the house had still known how to laugh. "I would like to hear it laugh again," Serafina said, as they paused beside an old stone fountain, dry now and choked with fallen leaves, not forgetting what came before, simply making room for what might still come after. The Duke looked at the fountain for a long moment, then at her, and something in his dark eyes had eased since that first cold night in the study. Some small weight lifted, if not entirely, then at least enough to notice. "So would I," he said quietly. "So would I, Lady Ashworth, more than I have admitted to myself in a very long time." They walked on together as the afternoon light spread golden across the wild grounds of Crowmoor, and Serafina found herself thinking, not for the first time since her arrival, that perhaps her father's promise, however strange its origins, had led her towards something she had not expected to find at the end of that long, storm-darkened road. Not merely duty, not merely obligation, something that might, given time and care and the willingness of two careful hearts, grow into more than either of them yet dared to name aloud. That evening, before retiring, Serafina wrote at last to her father, though the letter she composed said far less about fear and far more about hope than she had imagined it would when she first sat down at that stubborn desk drawer 3 nights before. The letter announcing the engagement had scarcely left Crowmoor before the whispers began, traveling faster along the roads of gossip than any carriage could travel along the roads of stone. By the time Serafina and the Duke rode into the nearby town of Ashbury for the reading of the banns, it seemed every face that turned toward them already knew more about their arrangement than either of them had chosen to share. "They will talk," the Duke said quietly, as their carriage rolled past a cluster of women who fell silent and then burst into hurried murmuring the moment the wheels had passed. "They always do, in towns this size. I am sorry you must bear it so soon." "I expected as much," Serafina replied, though her chin lifted a fraction higher than strictly necessary, a small defiance she could not quite suppress. A duke who has remained a widower 3 years does not suddenly announce a marriage without inviting a great deal of curiosity. "I would rather they talk openly than whisper behind closed doors, where I cannot answer them at all." He glanced at her with something like admiration, quickly masked, as was his habit. "You have more courage than most women who arrive at Crowmoor, expecting only a title and a quiet life." "I did not come here expecting a quiet life, Your Grace. I came here expecting very little, and have found, instead, rather more than I bargained for." She allowed herself a small smile, the first she had offered him so openly, and was pleased to see it returned, however briefly, before his usual careful composure settled back into place. The reading of the banns passed without incident, though Serafina noticed the vicar's wife watching her with open curiosity from a nearby pew, and overheard, quite by accident, 2 merchants outside the church discussing whether the new duchess had been chosen for love or merely for the size of her father's remaining fortune. She said nothing of this to the Duke, not wishing to burden him further, though the words lodged themselves uncomfortably in her mind regardless. It was 3 days later, while Serafina sat in the library attempting to lose herself in a novel she could not quite concentrate on, that Mrs. Whitfield appeared at the door with an expression more troubled than Serafina had yet seen on the housekeeper's normally composed face. "My lady, forgive the interruption. Lady Ophelia has arrived, and she has asked to see you directly, before speaking with His Grace." Serafina set down her book, curious rather than alarmed, though something in Mrs. Whitfield's tone suggested this visit was not entirely welcome. "Lady Ophelia? His Grace's aunt, my lady, his late mother's sister. She does not visit often, and when she does, it is rarely for pleasant reasons alone." Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, then added, more quietly, "She was very fond of the first Duchess, my lady. Very fond indeed." Serafina understood the warning contained within those words, and rose to meet her visitor, with as much composure as she could gather on short notice. She found Lady Ophelia waiting in the drawing room, a tall, sharp-featured woman, perhaps 60 years of age, dressed severely in dark traveling clothes, her eyes moving over the room, with the same swift, assessing quality Serafina had noticed in Mrs. Whitfield on her first evening at Crowmoor, though considerably less kind. "So you are the one," Lady Ophelia said, without preamble, before Serafina had even fully entered the room. "The one my nephew has decided will replace Margaret in this house." "I do not seek to replace anyone, Lady Ophelia." Serafina kept her voice level, though the directness of the attack had caught her somewhat off guard. "I am aware that His Grace's first marriage held a place in this house that I could not hope to occupy even if I wished to, which I do not. I wish only to occupy a place of my own." Something in Lady Ophelia's expression shifted slightly at this answer, though whether toward approval or continued suspicion, Serafina could not yet tell. A diplomatic answer. Margaret was not diplomatic. She was warm, and honest, and utterly without artifice, and this house loved her for it, every stone and servant of it, myself included. "I have come to see whether the woman my nephew intends to marry deserves to walk in her footsteps, or whether this is simply another arrangement made in haste, to satisfy an old debt and an older duty. I cannot answer for what I deserve, Lady Ophelia. I can only tell you what I intend." Serafina drew a slow breath, steadying herself. "I do not intend to walk in anyone's footsteps. I intend to make my own path through this house, in whatever time I am given to do so, and I would ask that you judge me by that path, rather than by comparison to a woman I never had the honor of meeting." Lady Ophelia studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly, and then, unexpectedly, something like the ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "That, at least, is the correct answer, whatever your true intentions may be." Margaret would have said something very similar, though with considerably more warmth in the delivery, if I am honest. "I am told I am rather better at honesty than warmth," Serafina admitted, and this time Lady Ophelia's smile did not disappear so quickly. "We shall see whether that improves with time." The older woman settled herself into a chair without invitation, a gesture that suggested she considered herself entirely at home in Crowmoor, regardless of who currently held the title of mistress. "Now, tell me plainly, girl, and do not waste my time with pretty phrases. Do you love my nephew, or does this remain, as I suspect, an arrangement of convenience, dressed up in wedding clothes?" Serafina considered lying, or at least softening the truth into something more comfortable, but something about Lady Ophelia's directness demanded an equally direct response. "I do not love him yet, Lady Ophelia. I have known him only a matter of days, but I do not believe I am entering this marriage blindly, or purely out of duty. I have seen enough of him, in that short time, to believe that something real might grow between us, given patience and honesty on both sides. Whether it does remains to be seen. I will not promise you a love I have not yet earned the right to claim." Lady Ophelia was quiet for a long moment, studying Serafina with an expression that had softened considerably from the suspicion with which she had first entered the room. "That," she said finally, "is the most honest answer I have received from anyone in this house in 3 years. My nephew has spent that time surrounded by people who either flatter him or avoid him entirely, neither of which does a grieving man any good at all. I confess, I did not expect to find honesty waiting for me in a girl young enough to be my granddaughter. I have found, Lady Ophelia, that honesty tends to serve better than flattery, particularly in a house that has clearly grown weary of pretense." The older woman laughed then, a short, surprised sound, and rose from her chair, with considerably more warmth in her manner than she had shown upon arrival. "Perhaps you will do after all. Come, walk with me in the garden, before my nephew realizes I have arrived and comes to smooth over whatever damage he assumes I have already done. I find I would rather speak with you a while longer before he interrupts us." They walked together through the wild, overgrown gardens, and Lady Ophelia spoke, gradually and without prompting, of Margaret, of the early years of the Duke's first marriage, of the slow, unlikely way affection had grown between two young people thrown together by their father's ambitions. She spoke too of the Duke as a boy, quieter even then than most children, and of the change that had come over him after Margaret's death, a stillness that had settled so deeply into him that his own aunt had feared, at times, he might never fully emerge from it. You have already coaxed more life into him in a matter of days than I have managed in 3 years of visits, Lady Ophelia said, as they paused beside the same dry fountain where Seraphina and the Duke had spoken days before. Whatever this arrangement was meant to be at its beginning, I begin to suspect it may yet become something rather more than either of you bargained for. I hope so, Lady Ophelia, Seraphina said quietly, surprising herself with the honesty of the admission. I find, rather to my own surprise, that I hope so very much indeed. It was later that same evening, after Lady Ophelia had departed with considerably more warmth toward Seraphina than she had arrived with, that a second, less welcome piece of news reached Crowmoor Hall. A letter arrived by messenger, addressed to the Duke, and Seraphina watched from across the drawing room as his expression darkened while he read it, the careful stillness she had come to associate with him, hardening into something closer to genuine concern. Is something wrong, Your Grace? He folded the letter slowly, his jaw tight. An old associate of your father's has written to me, a man named Baron Halvery. He claims to hold certain debts against your father's estate. Debts, he says, predate the promise made between our fathers, and he suggests that this marriage may not settle matters quite as cleanly as we have assumed. He looked up at her, and for the first time since her arrival, she saw genuine worry in his dark eyes, worry that seemed, unmistakably, to be for her rather than for himself. He requests a meeting, here at Crowmoor, within the fortnight. Seraphina felt a chill settle over her, quite different from the cold she had felt on her first night at Crowmoor, sharper and more immediate. What sort of debts, Your Grace? I do not yet know, but I intend to find out, and I promise you this, Lady Ashworth. His voice hardened, taking on a quality she had not heard from him before, protective and certain, in a way that surprised her as much as it steadied her. Whatever Baron Halvery believes he is owed, he will not use it to threaten you while you remain under my protection. That much, at least, I can promise with absolute certainty. Seraphina looked at him for a long moment, this careful, guarded man who had, in the space of a single evening, shown her both his aunt's grudging approval and his own fierce, unexpected resolve to shield her from whatever storm was gathering beyond Crowmoor's gates. Whatever Baron Halvery intended, she found herself believing, more firmly than she had expected to so soon, that she would not have to face it alone. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the tall windows of the drawing room, and somewhere beyond the wild gardens and the dry stone fountain, a new storm was gathering, one that neither of them yet fully understood, but which both of them, in their own quiet ways, had already resolved to weather together. The fortnight before the wedding passed more quickly than Seraphina had expected, though not without its shadows. Baron Halvery's letter remained unanswered for now. The meeting he requested pushed back at the Duke's insistence until after the ceremony, a small mercy that allowed Seraphina to focus, at least for a time, on the wedding itself, rather than the uncertain debt hanging over her father's name. The morning of the wedding arrived pale and clear, the storms of the previous weeks finally giving way to a soft autumn sky, and Seraphina stood at the window of her chamber, watching the first carriages arrive along the long drive to Crowmoor Hall. Lucy moved quietly behind her, fastening the final buttons of a gown the color of early morning light, pale gold and cream, chosen not for its grandness, but for the simple fact that Seraphina had felt, the moment she saw it, that it belonged to her, rather than to some idea of what a duchess ought to wear. "You look lovely, my lady," Lucy said softly, stepping back to admire her work, "if I may say so." "You may say so as often as you like, Lucy. I confess I have need of the reassurance." Seraphina studied her own reflection, searching for the fear she had expected to find there, and finding, instead, something steadier, something almost like readiness. "Is His Grace already downstairs?" "He has been pacing the small parlor since dawn, my lady, though he will deny it if you ask him directly." Lucy's mouth twitched with the beginning of a smile. "Mrs. Whitfield says she has never seen him so restless, not even on the morning of his first wedding, many years past." Seraphina felt something warm unfold in her chest at this small piece of news, an unexpected comfort in learning that the Duke's composure, so carefully maintained in every other circumstance, had finally cracked, however slightly, under the weight of this particular morning. The ceremony itself was small, held in the old stone chapel at the edge of the Crowmoor grounds, attended by Lady Ophelia, who had returned for the occasion, with rather more warmth than her first visit had suggested she possessed, along with a handful of tenants and neighbors, and Serafina's own father, who had traveled from his estate looking older and more tired than she remembered, though his eyes shone with something like relief when he saw her walking toward the altar. The Duke waited for her there, dressed in dark clothes that suited him far better than the formal court dress she had half expected, and when she reached him, he took her hand with a gentleness that surprised her, given how careful and guarded he had been in every other moment since her arrival. The vicar spoke the familiar words, and Serafina found herself listening to them properly for the first time in her life, understanding, as she had not fully understood before, exactly what she was agreeing to, and exactly how much she hoped, against all reasonable expectation, that this particular arrangement might yet become something worth the promise. When at last they were pronounced husband and wife, the Duke leaned close and spoke words meant only for her, quiet enough that no one else in the small chapel could hear them. "Whatever comes, Lady Ashfield, I am glad it is you standing here beside me." It was the first time he had called her by her new name, and something in the sound of it, spoken so softly and with such evident sincerity, settled a warmth into her chest that lingered long after the ceremony had ended. The small gathering that followed was modest by the standards of the ton, though warmer than Serafina had expected, given everything she had learned of Crowmoor's long silence. Lady Ophelia toasted the new couple with genuine affection, her earlier suspicion entirely dissolved, and even the tenants who had come to witness the ceremony seemed, for the first time in years, cautiously hopeful that their long-absent laughter might finally be returning to the great house on the hill. Serafina's father drew her aside during a quiet moment, his hand resting on her shoulder with the particular weight of a man who had carried guilt for a long while, and finally found the chance to set some portion of it down. "I am sorry, my dear, that I gave you so little choice in this matter. I have worried every day since sending you here that I asked too much of you, for the sake of a promise made before you were even born. You need not apologize, Father." Serafina covered his hand with her own, surprised by how true the words felt as she spoke them. "I confess, I arrived here afraid, and uncertain, and more than a little angry, at the position you had placed me in. But I have found something at Crowmoor I did not expect to find, and I do not regret the road that led me here, however difficult its beginning." Her father's eyes glistened, and he pressed a kiss to her forehead, the same gesture he had used since her childhood, and said nothing further, though his silence carried more relief and gratitude than any words might have managed. The evening ended quietly, the small gathering dispersing as the sun set behind the hills, and Serafina found herself, for the first time, alone with her new husband, in the private rooms that had, until that morning, belonged to him alone. A fire burned in the hearth, the first she had seen lit in that particular chamber, casting warm light across furniture that had clearly been chosen with care many years before, though little of it had been touched since. "I had these rooms prepared for you," the Duke said, watching her take in her surroundings with an expression she could not quite name, somewhere between hope and hesitation. "I did not wish you to feel as though you were simply inheriting Margaret's spaces, or living in her shadow. These rooms have stood empty since before I married her. They are entirely new to both of us." Serafina turned to look at him, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture, small as it might have seemed to someone who did not understand the weight of everything else in that house. "Thank you. That means more to me than I can easily say." He crossed the room slowly, stopping a respectful distance away, and something in his careful posture told her he was working up to a confession of some kind, gathering courage in the same deliberate way he had gathered it on her first night at Crowmoor, before delivering his father's judgment without apology. "I did not expect to marry again," he said quietly. "After Margaret, I told myself, quite firmly, that I had already been given more happiness than most men receive in a lifetime, and that asking for a second measure of it would be both foolish and unfair to whatever unfortunate woman found herself bound to a man still so thoroughly haunted by grief. I agreed to honor my father's promise because duty demanded it, not because I believed it would bring me anything beyond an heir and a quiet peace from those who whispered about the ending of my line. And now?" Serafina asked softly, though she thought she already knew, at least in part, what his answer would be. "Now I find myself standing in a room I prepared for a stranger, married to a woman who has, in the span of a few short weeks, coaxed more life back into this house and into myself than I believed remained to be coaxed. He met her eyes, and for the first time since her arrival, she saw him entirely without his careful armor, open and uncertain in a way that made him seem, suddenly, far younger than his years. I did not expect to want this marriage to be more than an arrangement, Lady Ashfield. And yet I find that I do want it, very much, though I do not yet know how to ask for such a thing without fear of asking for too much, too soon. Serafina crossed the remaining distance between them, her heart beating quickly but steadily, and took his hand in hers, the same gesture he had offered her at the altar hours before. I never expected to be wanted at all, Your Grace. Not truly, not for myself, rather than for what I could provide. My father's estate is modest, my dowry smaller still, and I have spent most of my life believing myself useful, rather than valued. If you are telling me that you want more than duty from this marriage, then I will tell you plainly that I want the same, and I am not afraid to say so, whatever risk it carries for either of us. Something eased in his face then, a tension she had not fully realized he carried, until she watched it release, and he lifted her hand to his lips, a gesture both formal and, somehow, entirely sincere. Then perhaps, he said quietly, we might allow ourselves to hope for rather more than either of us expected when this arrangement began. Perhaps we might, Serafina agreed, and found, standing there in the firelight of a room prepared with unexpected care, that hope no longer felt like a foolish indulgence, but like the first honest step toward something neither duty nor grief could fully explain. Outside, the autumn night settled quietly over Crowmoor Hall, the gardens finally growing still after weeks of storm, and within its old stone walls, for the first time in 3 long years, something that might, in time, become genuine happiness had begun, however cautiously, to take root. Winter arrived at Crowmoor with a gentleness that surprised everyone in the household, as though the season itself had taken note of the changes stirring within those old stone walls, and decided to temper its usual harshness accordingly. Serafina spent the early weeks of her marriage learning the rhythms of the estate, walking the tenant farms with the Duke at her side, listening to disputes over boundary fences and grazing rights, and discovering, gradually, that she had a talent for smoothing tempers that even her husband had not fully anticipated. It was during one such visit, to a farmer named Nathaniel Price, whose family had worked Crowmoor land for 3 generations, that Serafina first suggested reopening the great ballroom that had stood dark and shuttered since Margaret's death. The Price girl is to be married in the spring, she said to the Duke that evening, as they sat together in the small parlor that had, over the preceding weeks, become their preferred place for quiet conversation. Nathaniel mentioned, quite without complaint, that the family has always celebrated such occasions at the manor, in years past, when your father held the title. It seems the tradition faded along with so much else these last 3 years. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, and Serafina watched the familiar shadow cross his face, the one that appeared whenever conversation drew too near the years of his grief. The ballroom has not been opened since Margaret's final winter. I confess, I have avoided even walking past its doors. I am not suggesting we force ourselves into forgetting anything, Gideon. It was the first time she had used his given name so plainly, and she saw him notice it, something warming in his expression despite the difficulty of the conversation. I am suggesting only that a house this large, and a family with tenants who have relied on its warmth for generations, should not remain closed forever because of a grief that, however real, need not swallow every corner of what remains. He considered this for a long while, staring into the fire rather than at her, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried more vulnerability than she had heard from him even on their wedding night. I am afraid, Serafina. Afraid that opening those doors again will feel like a betrayal of everything Margaret and I built there together, and afraid, too, that it will not feel like betrayal at all, and that this fear of forgetting her is simply another way of punishing myself for a loss that was never truly my fault. I think, Serafina said gently, moving to sit beside him rather than across from him, that honoring her memory and allowing this house to live again are not opposites. Whatever grief has convinced you to believe, we could hold the celebration in her honor, in fact, a tribute rather than a replacement. I do not wish to erase what came before me, Gideon. I wish only to help you carry it more gently than you have been carrying it alone." He turned to look at her then, and something in his dark eyes had softened considerably since the guarded stranger who had greeted her in that cold study months before. "You continue to surprise me, Lady Ashfield. I did not expect, when I agreed to my father's promise, that I would find a wife capable of understanding grief so thoroughly, without ever having met the woman who caused it." "Perhaps grief is not so difficult to understand," she said softly, "when one has learned to recognize its shape in a house full of closed doors and silent servants." The ballroom was opened 3 days later, the dust sheets pulled back from furniture that had waited patiently for 3 long years, the great windows washed until light poured freely across polished floors for the first time since Margaret's death. Serafina worked alongside the servants herself, refusing to simply direct from a distance, and found, in the physical labor of restoration, a satisfaction that surprised her, each swept corner and polished surface feeling like a small victory against the silence that had ruled Crowmoor for so long. The celebration for the Price wedding brought more guests to Crowmoor than the house had seen in years. Tenants and neighbors, and a handful of old friends, the Duke had not invited to anything in longer than he cared to admit. Serafina watched him move through the crowded ballroom that evening, with something like wonder, seeing him laugh, actually laugh, at a story told by one of his oldest tenants, seeing him dance, stiffly at first and then with growing ease, first with the bride's mother, and then, as the evening wore on, with Serafina herself. "You have given this house something I did not believe it could recover," Lady Ophelia said quietly, appearing at Serafina's side as the dancing continued, and the Duke moved among his guests with an openness she had not witnessed in years. "I confess I did not expect, when I first arrived suspicious and sharp-tongued, to watch my nephew smile so freely within a single season of his second marriage. He has done most of the work himself, Lady Ophelia. I have only opened a few doors. He was ready, at last, to walk through." Serafina watched the Duke laugh again, at something Nathaniel Price had said, his whole face transformed by an ease she had not seen since her arrival. "Grief does not disappear simply because joy returns beside it. I believe he has simply found room enough, at last, for both to exist together." "That is wisdom beyond your years, my dear." Lady Ophelia patted her hand affectionately, a gesture that would have seemed impossible during their first, prickly meeting months before. "Margaret would have liked you, I think. She had little patience for pretense, and even less for people who mistook stubbornness for strength. You remind me of her in more ways than I expected, though you are entirely your own woman as well, which I suspect is precisely why my nephew has begun to fall in love with you, whether he has admitted it to himself yet or not." Serafina felt her cheeks warm at this observation, though she said nothing in response, watching instead as the Duke crossed the ballroom toward her, his expression softer than she had ever seen it, the careful stillness of their first meeting entirely absent from his face. "May I have this dance, Lady Ashfield?" he asked, extending his hand with a small, genuine smile that reached all the way to his dark eyes. "You may," she said, taking his hand and allowing him to lead her into the swirl of dancers, the music filling the ballroom that had stood silent for 3 long years, the light from 100 candles reflecting off newly polished floors and casting a warm glow across a house that had, at last, remembered how to celebrate rather than merely endure. They danced together for the remainder of the evening, and Serafina noticed, as the celebration wound toward its close, that the Duke's guarded stillness had given way, gradually and almost entirely, to something lighter, something that looked, more than anything else, like genuine happiness. When the last guests finally departed, and the great house settled into its late-night quiet, he walked her back to their private chambers, with her hand still resting in his, and paused at the door, turning to face her with an expression of such open sincerity that she felt her breath catch slightly. "Thank you," he said simply, "for tonight, and for everything these past months have taught me about allowing myself to hope again. You have done the harder work yourself, Gideon. I have only stood beside you while you did it." She reached up to touch his face gently, surprised by her own boldness, though he did not pull away, leaning instead into the warmth of her hand against his cheek. "I am proud of you, if I may say so, prouder than I expected to be of a man I barely knew when I first arrived at these gates." "And I," he said quietly, covering her hand with his own. "Have come to care for you more deeply than I believed possible. In a span of time far shorter than I ever imagined such feelings could take root. I do not say this lightly, Serafina, nor without considerable fear of what such an admission might cost me, should fortune prove as cruel to us as it once proved to me before. But I find I can no longer keep such feelings entirely to myself, whatever risk they carry." Serafina felt her heart swell with something warm and unguarded, an emotion she had not allowed herself to fully name until that moment. Standing in the quiet hallway outside their chambers, the last echoes of music still drifting faintly from the ballroom below. "Then do not keep it to yourself any longer," she said softly. "I have come to care for you as well, Gideon, more deeply than I expected, and more quickly than I ever thought wise. But wisdom has little say in matters of the heart, I have found, and I would rather risk this feeling openly than guard it so carefully that it withers before it has the chance to grow." He drew her close then, and for the first time since their marriage began, their kiss held nothing of duty or arrangement, only the honest warmth of two people who had, against every reasonable expectation, found something real growing between them in the space of a single season. Outside, the winter stars shone clear and cold above Crowmoor Hall, and within its walls, for the first time in 3 long years, the house held not silence, but the quiet, contented breathing of two hearts, finally allowing themselves to hope. The knock at the door came harder than any servant would have dared to knock. 3 sharp strikes that echoed through the entrance hall like a warning, and Serafina felt her stomach tighten before Mrs. Whitfield had even reached the handle. She had been expecting this visit for weeks, ever since the letter arrived on their wedding eve, and yet nothing about the waiting had prepared her for the sudden reality of it, standing there in the drawing room, with her husband's hand tightening protectively around her own. Baron Halvery entered without waiting to be properly announced, a heavy-set man with cold eyes and an expensive coat that seemed chosen to announce wealth rather than to suit the winter weather outside. He looked around the drawing room with open assessment, the same way a merchant might examine goods before deciding their price, and Serafina felt an immediate, instinctive dislike settle over her before he had spoken a single word. "Your Grace." Halvery bowed, though the gesture carried none of the respect it should have. "And the new Duchess. I confess I did not expect to find you both so settled, given the delicacy of the matter I have come to discuss. State your business plainly, Baron Halvery." The Duke's voice carried a coldness Serafina had not heard since her very first night at Crowmoor, the careful stillness returning in full force, though this time she recognized it for what it was, a shield raised in her defense, rather than a wall built against her. "You wrote of debts owed by Lord Ashworth. I would hear the particulars, and I would hear them now." Halvery's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Very well, Your Grace, since you prefer directness. Some years ago, Lord Ashworth borrowed a considerable sum from me, against the promise of his daughter's eventual marriage settlement. He assured me, at the time, that her hand would come with a dowry sufficient to cover both the original loan and the interest accrued upon it. Instead, I understand, she has married into Crowmoor with scarcely any settlement at all, the marriage having been arranged through some old promise between fathers, rather than through the ordinary channels of negotiation." Serafina felt the color drain from her face. "My father never mentioned any such debt to me." "I imagine he did not, my lady, given how poorly it reflects upon him." Halvery's cold eyes moved to her, and something in his gaze made her want to step back, though she forced herself to remain still, her chin lifted, despite the fear coiling in her chest. "The debt remains unpaid, and I have come to collect it, one way or another. If His Grace is unwilling to settle the sum on your father's behalf, I confess I see little reason to remain quiet about the circumstances of this marriage, circumstances that certain members of society might find rather scandalous, should they learn the full truth of how casually your father traded away his daughter's future to satisfy his own debts. You are suggesting blackmail, Baron Halvery, dressed up as a business matter." The Duke's voice had gone dangerously quiet, and Serafina glanced at him, seeing a hardness in his expression she had not witnessed before, a controlled fury that seemed all the more formidable for how carefully it was contained. "I would think carefully before continuing down this particular road. I am merely stating facts, Your Grace, facts that could prove rather uncomfortable, should they reach the ears of the ton, particularly given how recently the marriage was celebrated. and how quickly certain rumors already circulate regarding its true nature. Halvary's smile widened slightly, sensing an advantage he clearly believed he held. I am a reasonable man. Settle the debt, with appropriate interest for the delay, and I will consider the matter closed, with no further mention of it to anyone. Serafina felt fear tighten around her chest, not merely for herself, but for her father, whose name and honor now hung so precariously in the balance of this cold, calculating man's demands. She thought of her father's tired eyes at the wedding, his relief at seeing her settled, and wondered, with sudden dread, what desperation might have driven him to such a debt in the first place, and what shame he must have carried in silence rather than confess it to her directly. How much, the Duke asked flatly, do you claim is owed? Halvary named a sum that made Serafina's breath catch, a figure large enough to strain even Crowmoor's considerable resources, though the Duke's expression did not change at the number, betraying nothing of whatever calculations were occurring behind his carefully controlled composure. I will need time to verify the particulars of this debt, the Duke said finally, his voice cold and even. I do not simply hand over sums of that size on the word of a man who arrives at my door making threats rather than presenting honest accounts. You will provide documentation, Baron Halvary, proper documentation, signed by Lord Ashworth and witnessed appropriately, or you will find that I have considerably more patience for scandal than you have for an empty purse. Something flickered across Halvary's face, a brief uncertainty quickly masked, and Serafina understood, watching it, that her husband had found some weakness in the other man's confidence, some crack in the certainty he had arrived with. I will provide what documentation I have, Halvary said, though his voice carried less bravado than before. You will find it entirely in order, Your Grace, whatever suspicions you may harbor. Then I look forward to examining it. Good day, Baron Halvary. The Duke's tone left no room for further discussion, and after a moment of visible hesitation, Halvary bowed stiffly and departed, leaving behind a silence in the drawing room heavier than any that had settled there since Serafina's arrival. Gideon. Serafina turned to her husband the moment the door closed behind their unwelcome visitor, her earlier fear giving way to a flood of questions she could no longer contain. Do you believe him? About my father? The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, before he finally answered. I do not know what to believe. Not yet. Your father is an honorable man, Serafina. Whatever difficulties may have driven him to borrow against your future. I do not judge him for whatever desperation led him to such a choice, if indeed he made it, but I will not simply hand over a fortune to a man like Halvary, without proof, whatever threats he cares to make against our reputation. And if the debt is real, if my father truly did what Halvary claims, then we will settle it, quietly and properly, and your father's name will remain untouched by scandal, whatever the cost to Crowmoor's own accounts. He took her hands in his earlier coldness melting away entirely, replaced by the gentle warmth she had come to know so well over the preceding months. You are my wife, Serafina, and your father's honor is now bound to mine, whatever debts or difficulties threaten it. I will not let a man like Halvary use fear to extract more from us than is rightfully owed, but I will not let your father's name suffer either, if there is any way I can prevent it. Serafina felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the fierce protectiveness in his voice, so different from the careful, guarded stranger who had greeted her on her very first night at Crowmoor. Thank you, she whispered, for standing beside me in this, whatever comes of it. I will always stand beside you, he said quietly, drawing her into an embrace that felt, in that uncertain moment, like the only steady ground remaining in a world suddenly full of new and unexpected dangers. That much at least, I can promise you with absolute certainty, whatever else this arrangement of ours may still hold in store. That night, as Serafina lay awake beside her husband, listening to his steady breathing and watching moonlight fall across the ceiling of their private chamber, she found herself thinking not of Halvary's threats, nor even of her father's possible desperation, but of the fierce, unwavering protectiveness she had seen in Gideon's eyes as he faced down a man determined to use fear as a weapon against them both. Whatever storms still lay ahead, whatever secrets Halvary's visit had yet to fully uncover, she found that she no longer faced them as a stranger, arriving at a cold and silent house. She faced them now, as a wife, standing beside a husband who had chosen, freely and without hesitation, to place himself between her and whatever darkness threatened to reach her. And in that quiet certainty, however uncertain the coming days might prove to be, Serafina found a strength she had not known she possessed until Crowmoor Hall, and the man who ruled it, had given her reason enough to claim it. The documents arrived from Baron Halvery a week later, delivered by a nervous clerk who seemed eager to be away from Crowmoor as quickly as possible, and the Duke spent 2 full days locked in his study, poring over them alongside his solicitor, a careful, precise man named Edmund Barlow, who had served the Ashfield family for over 20 years. Serafina waited through those 2 days with a knot of anxiety that refused to loosen, uncertain what truth the papers might reveal about her father, and uncertain, too, what such a truth might mean for the fragile happiness she had only recently allowed herself to claim. It was Edmund Barlow who finally emerged from the study on the second evening, his expression carefully neutral in the manner of a man long accustomed to delivering difficult news gently. He asked to speak with Serafina directly, and led her into the study, where the Duke sat surrounded by scattered papers, his face drawn with a mixture of relief and lingering anger that she could not immediately interpret. "Lady Ashfield." Edmund gestured toward a chair, and she sat, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "I have examined Baron Halvery's documentation thoroughly, alongside his grace, and I believe we have found the truth of the matter, though it is rather different from what Halvery led us to believe. Tell me plainly, please. I have imagined a dozen terrible possibilities these past 2 days, and I would rather know the truth than continue guessing at it." Edmund exchanged a glance with the Duke, who nodded slightly, and continued. "Your father did indeed borrow a sum from Baron Halvery, several years ago, though not, as Halvery suggested, against the promise of your marriage settlement. The loan was taken to cover the costs of a fever that swept through his tenant farms one particularly harsh winter, a fever that threatened to claim dozens of lives among families who had served his estate faithfully for generations. Your father borrowed the money to secure medicine and proper care for those families, at considerable personal cost to his own finances, and he never fully recovered from the burden of that debt in the years since." Serafina felt tears rise unexpectedly, thinking of her father's tired eyes, his quiet burdens carried alone rather than shared, out of what she now understood to be a kind of stubborn, protective pride. "He never told me, all this time, and he never once mentioned it. He would not have wished to burden you with it, my lady, particularly given how the debt has grown under Halvery's considerable interest over the years." Edmund's voice softened slightly. "As for the connection Halvery drew between the debt and your marriage settlement, we have found no evidence whatsoever to support such a claim. It appears to have been an invention entirely his own, an attempt to extract a larger sum from his grace, by suggesting a scandal that does not, in fact, exist." "He lied," Serafina said, anger rising now alongside her earlier fear. "He came here, and threatened us with a scandal, built on nothing more than his own invention." "He did." The Duke's voice was hard, though it carried none of the coldness she had heard directed at Halvery himself. "And he will answer for it, Serafina, though not through public scandal, which would serve no one's interest but his own. Edmund has already begun the necessary arrangements to settle your father's original debt, at fair terms rather than the inflated sum Halvery demanded, and to ensure that Baron Halvery understands, quite clearly, that any further attempt to threaten this family with fabricated scandal will be met with legal consequences considerably more severe than he currently anticipates." Serafina felt relief wash over her, so profound it left her momentarily unable to speak, and it was several moments before she trusted her voice enough to respond. "Thank you, both of you. I do not know how I would have managed these past 2 days without your steady hand guiding us through it." Edmund excused himself shortly after, leaving husband and wife alone in the study, and Serafina found herself studying Gideon's face in the quiet that followed, noticing something in his expression that seemed to hold more than simple relief at the resolution of Halvery's threat. "There is something else," she said softly. "I can see it in your face, Gideon. What is it?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she had rarely heard from him, even in their most intimate moments together. "There is something I have not yet told you, Serafina, something I should have shared long before now, though I confess cowardice kept me from it." Her heart quickened, uncertain what confession might follow such a beginning. "Tell me now then, whatever it is. You asked me once, on your very first night at Crowmoor, Why my father's promise fell upon you specifically, rather than some other woman my father might have chosen to satisfy the debt. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening grounds beyond, much as he had done on that very first evening. I told you it was simply the arrangement made between our fathers, and that was true, as far as it went, but it was not the entire truth. What is the entire truth then? He turned to face her, and she saw, for the first time, genuine nervousness in his expression, an uncertainty that seemed almost foreign on a man she had come to know as so carefully composed. 3 years ago, before Margaret's death, I attended a gathering at your father's estate, a small affair, to which I had been invited, more out of courtesy between old family friends than any expectation of significant company. You were there, though we did not speak at length, and you likely do not remember the encounter at all, given how brief it was, and how little attention I imagine you paid to a stranger passing through your father's drawing room. Serafina searched her memory, and found, gradually, a faint recollection surfacing, a tall, quiet man standing near the edge of a crowded room, saying little, watching more than he spoke. I remember someone, I think, a guest, who seemed rather out of place among the more talkative company. That was me. He held her gaze steadily now, though color had risen faintly in his face, an unguarded embarrassment she found almost endearing, given how rarely she had seen him anything but composed. I did not speak with you at length that evening, but I watched you a great deal, more than propriety strictly allowed. You spent most of the gathering in quiet conversation with an elderly tenant who had clearly lost his wife not long before, and I watched you listen to him with such genuine kindness, such patience, that I found myself thinking, quite unexpectedly, that here was a woman who understood grief, without needing to have suffered it herself, at least not yet. I do not remember that particular conversation, Serafina admitted softly, though it sounds like something I would have done. I never forgot it. When Margaret died, and the years passed, and my father's old promise remained folded away in a drawer of this very desk, largely forgotten by everyone but Halvery, it seems, I found myself thinking of that evening more often than I expected to, when my aunt finally pressed me, once again, about securing an heir and settling the future of this house. I remembered the young woman who had shown such quiet kindness to a grieving stranger, and I made a decision that I have not fully admitted to you until this moment. He crossed the room to stand before her, taking her hands gently in his own. I asked my solicitor to determine whether my father's old promise to your father remained honorable and binding. I did not wait for your father to raise the matter, Serafina. I requested it myself, specifically, because I remembered a young woman's kindness from a single evening 3 years past, and because some part of me, even in the depths of my grief, hoped that such kindness might one day be turned toward me as well. Serafina stared at him, stunned into silence by this revelation, everything she had believed about the arrangement shifting suddenly beneath her feet. You chose me, specifically. It was not merely my father's honor that brought me here. It was not merely duty, no, though I told myself it was, for a long while, because admitting otherwise felt like admitting a hope I did not believe I deserved to hold, so soon after losing Margaret. His grip on her hands tightened slightly, and she saw something like fear in his eyes now, fear of her reaction to this long-delayed confession. I am sorry I did not tell you sooner. I understand, if this changes how you view everything that has passed between us these past months. Serafina felt a swirl of emotions she could not immediately untangle, surprise, and something warmer beneath it, a kind of wonder at the thought that she had been chosen, deliberately and specifically, rather than simply delivered as payment for an old debt. It does change things, she said slowly, watching his face tighten with anticipated disappointment, before she continued. It changes them for the better, Gideon. I came here believing myself an obligation, a debt to be paid rather than a person to be wanted. Learning that you chose me, that you remembered a single evening and carried that memory through years of grief until you found the courage to act upon it, means more to me than I can easily express. Relief flooded his face, and he drew her into his arms, holding her close in the quiet study, where the truth of their beginning had finally been laid fully bare. Then you are not angry with me for the delay in sharing this? I am not angry. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. I am only grateful, Gideon, that my father's honor, and your own hidden hope managed to lead us both to exactly the place we needed to be, even if neither of us fully understood the path while we were walking it. They stood together in the quiet study for a long while after that, the fire burning low in the hearth. The truth of their beginnings settled at last into something whole and honest between them, free of the old debts and hidden hopes that had shadowed it for so long. The rumor reached Crowmoor before the snow did, carried by a breathless letter from Lady Ophelia that arrived just as the first heavy flakes began to fall across the estate. Seraphina read it standing in the entrance hall, her cloak still damp from an afternoon walk, and felt the warmth of the fire behind her do nothing to chase away the sudden chill that settled over her. Baron Halvery, apparently unwilling to accept quiet defeat, had spent the past week whispering a different story through the drawing rooms of London society, one that painted Lord Ashworth as a desperate man who had sold his daughter's future to settle crushing debts, and painted the Duke of Crowmoor as either a fool, deceived by a scheming father, or worse, a willing accomplice to the entire arrangement. The truth, careful and documented as it was, mattered little against a story so eagerly repeated by drawing rooms hungry for scandal. "He cannot simply be allowed to say such things," Seraphina said, showing the letter to Gideon that evening, her voice tight with a fury she rarely allowed herself to show so openly. "We have the documentation. Edmund proved the truth of my father's debt beyond any reasonable doubt. The truth rarely travels as quickly as gossip, Seraphina. Whatever proof we hold in hand." The Duke read the letter twice, his expression darkening with each pass. "Halvery knows this well. He cannot extract money from us any longer, so he has decided instead to extract satisfaction through damage to our name, hoping perhaps that the resulting scandal will pressure us into a quiet settlement simply to make the whispering stop. Then what do? We face it directly, as we faced him directly when he first arrived at our door." Gideon folded the letter and set it aside, his jaw set with the same quiet determination she had come to rely upon. "Lady Ophelia has arranged an assembly in London for the coming week, meant originally as a simple winter gathering among old friends. I believe we should attend, together, and allow the truth to be seen plainly by anyone willing to look for it, rather than hiding from Halvery's whispers here at Crowmoor." Seraphina felt a flutter of nerves at the prospect, though beneath it, a steadier resolve was building as well. "You believe facing society directly will silence the rumors. I believe hiding from them will only confirm every worse suspicion Halvery hopes to plant. We have nothing to be ashamed of, Seraphina. Your father borrowed money to save the lives of families depending on him. I chose this marriage freely, for reasons that had nothing to do with debt or obligation, whatever old promise first opened the door between us. Let society see two people entirely at peace with the truth of their own story, and I suspect Halvery's whispers will find considerably less fertile ground to grow in." The journey to London took 2 difficult days through worsening snow, and Seraphina spent much of it worrying, not only for the coming assembly, but for her father, whose most recent letter had arrived thinner and more hesitant than his usual correspondence, mentioning briefly a weakness in his chest that his physician had advised him to rest through, though he had, characteristically, dismissed the concern as nothing more than the ordinary fatigue of winter. They arrived at Lady Ophelia's London townhouse the evening before the assembly, and found her waiting anxiously at the door, her earlier warmth replaced by visible worry. "I am glad you have come," she said, ushering them inside quickly. "The whispers have grown louder than I first indicated in my letter. Halvery has been thorough in his spite, and several prominent families have already begun to speak of the marriage with rather more suspicion than kindness." "Then we shall simply have to be more thorough in our truth," Gideon said firmly, though Seraphina noticed a tightness around his eyes that suggested even his considerable composure was being tested by the scope of the difficulty. The assembly itself, when they arrived the following evening, held a tension Seraphina could feel the moment they entered the crowded ballroom, conversations pausing briefly as heads turned toward them, whispers rising and falling like a tide she could almost hear breaking against the shore of her own composure. She kept her chin lifted, her hand steady on Gideon's arm, refusing to let the weight of so many curious, judging eyes bow her posture even slightly. It was Baron Halvery's own arrival, unexpected and unwelcome, that finally forced the matter into the open. He appeared near the center of the ballroom, during a lull in the music, his expression carrying the same cold confidence he had worn on his visit to Crowmoor, and made straight for where Seraphina and Gideon stood speaking with a small cluster of Lady Ophelia's friends. "Your Grace." Lady Ashfield, Halvary's bow was shallow, mocking rather than respectful, and his voice carried deliberately, pitched to reach the ears of everyone nearby. "I confess I did not expect to see you both showing your faces so boldly in London, given the circumstances of your marriage." The ballroom around them grew noticeably quieter, several heads turning toward the confrontation with open curiosity, and Seraphina felt her heart pound hard against her ribs, though she forced her expression to remain calm. "Baron Halvary." Gideon's voice was cold and clear, carrying easily through the sudden hush. "I believe you owe my wife and her father a public apology, rather than further insinuation. I hold documentation, properly witnessed and verified by my own solicitor, proving that Lord Ashworth's debt to you arose from his efforts to save the lives of fever-stricken tenants, and had nothing whatsoever to do with my marriage settlement, which you invented entirely to extract a larger payment through threat, rather than honest negotiation." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, and Seraphina saw uncertainty flicker across Halvary's face for the first time, his earlier confidence wavering slightly under the weight of so many curious eyes now turning in his direction rather than hers. "I have documentation of my own," Halvary said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Then produce it, Baron Halvary, here and now, before this entire assembly, and let us see whose account holds the weight of proper witness and honest record." Gideon's tone left no room for retreat, and Seraphina watched, with a mixture of fear and fierce pride, as her husband stood entirely unafraid, before a man who had tried to threaten them both into silence. Halvary had no documentation to produce, of course, and his silence in that moment, stretched long and uncomfortable, before an audience that had grown steadily less sympathetic to his cause, spoke louder than any words Gideon might have offered in his own defense. Within moments, the crowd's attention shifted decisively, murmurs of suspicion now directed toward the Baron, rather than toward the couple he had sought to shame, and Halvary, recognizing his defeat, made a hasty and thoroughly undignified retreat from the ballroom. The relief that flooded through Seraphina in the aftermath left her trembling slightly, and Gideon drew her gently aside, away from the curious eyes still lingering upon them, his hand steady and warm against her own. "You were magnificent," she whispered, still catching her breath from the tension of the confrontation. "We were magnificent," he corrected gently. "I could not have stood so firmly, without knowing you stood just as firmly beside me." It was only later that same evening, as the assembly wound toward its close and the danger of scandal finally began to feel truly behind them, that a servant arrived with urgent news that stole every ounce of relief from Seraphina's chest and replaced it with a fear far more personal than anything Halvary had threatened. Her father, the message explained, had collapsed suddenly at his estate that very afternoon, his weakened heart finally giving way under a strain his physician had warned against for weeks, and he now lay gravely ill, uncertain to survive the night. Seraphina felt the ballroom spin around her, and it was only Gideon's steady arms catching her, holding her upright against a grief that threatened to overwhelm her entirely, that kept her from collapsing where she stood. "We leave for his estate immediately," Gideon said, his voice firm, despite the late hour and the treacherous winter roads that lay between London and her father's house. "Whatever the weather, whatever the danger, I will not let you face this news without reaching his side." They departed within the hour, the carriage racing through snow-covered roads under a moon obscured by heavy clouds, Seraphina's hand clutched tightly in her husband's grip the entire journey, both of them silently praying that they would reach her father in time, that this particular storm, unlike so many others that had tested them in recent months, would not claim something neither of them was prepared to lose. The carriage reached her father's estate just as the first gray light of dawn began to break across the snow-covered hills, and Seraphina was out of the door and running up the front steps before the wheels had fully stopped turning, Gideon close behind her, his own face pale with worry, despite his steady, reassuring presence throughout the long night's journey. The physician met them in the entrance hall, his expression carefully neutral in the manner of a man unwilling to offer false hope before he was certain it was warranted, and Seraphina's heart clenched painfully at the sight of him. "He has survived the night," the physician said, and Serafina felt a sob of relief escape her before he had even finished speaking. His heart is weak, and he will require considerable rest and care in the months ahead. But the immediate danger has passed. I believe, with proper attention, he has every chance of recovery, though I will not pretend the road ahead will be an easy one. Serafina found her father awake when she entered his chamber, propped against a mountain of pillows, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes clear and alert when they found her own. "Serafina," he murmured, reaching for her hand as she rushed to his bedside. "I heard talk of Halvery and scandal, and I feared I would not live to see it resolved." "It is resolved, father. Entirely resolved, and you need not carry another moment's worry over it." She pressed his hand between both of her own, tears finally falling freely now that the fear of losing him had begun to ease. Gideon stood before all of London and forced Halvery to admit his lies. "Your name is safe, father. Your honor is entirely intact." Her father's eyes moved past her to where Gideon stood quietly near the door, and something like profound gratitude crossed his tired features. "You have done more for this family than any promise between old friends ever obligated you to do, your grace. I do not know how I will ever repay such a debt." "You owe me nothing, my lord." Gideon crossed the room and took the older man's other hand gently in his own. "You gave me a daughter who has brought more life back into Crowmoor Hall in a single season than I believed remained possible after 3 years of grief. Whatever debt existed between our families, I consider it entirely paid, many times over, by the gift of her presence in my life." Lord Ashworth's eyes glistened, and he squeezed his daughter's hand weakly. "Then I may rest easy at last, knowing you are settled with a man who values you as you deserve to be valued." The weeks that followed brought slow but steady improvement to Lord Ashworth's health, and Serafina divided her time carefully between her father's estate and Crowmoor Hall, nursing him through the difficult early days of his recovery, while Gideon attended to the final legal proceedings against Baron Halvery, whose reputation, once so carefully cultivated through threat and insinuation, now lay in ruins across every drawing room he had once used as a weapon against them. By the time spring finally arrived, chasing away the last stubborn traces of winter snow, Lord Ashworth had recovered enough to travel to Crowmoor himself, insisting he wished to see his daughter properly settled in her new home, before allowing himself to fully rest into the quieter life his physician had recommended. Serafina welcomed him with genuine joy, showing him through the gardens that had, over the preceding months, been carefully tended back from wildness into something between untamed beauty and deliberate care, a balance she had come to think of as entirely her own particular gift to the house that had once felt so thoroughly abandoned to grief. It was during that visit, on a warm evening in early spring, that Serafina finally found herself alone with Gideon, in the conservatory that had once stood as Margaret's favorite retreat, now flourishing under Serafina's own patient attention, green and vibrant, and full of new growth pushing up eagerly through soil that had waited a long while for someone willing to tend it properly again. "I have been thinking," she said softly, sitting beside him on the old stone bench that overlooked the wild, blooming garden beyond the glass walls, "about everything that brought us here. My father's illness, Halvery's threats, the letters I should never have read, and the promise made between our fathers so long before either of us had any say in the matter." "A long and difficult road," Gideon agreed, taking her hand gently in his own, "though I confess I would not change a single step of it, difficult as parts of it certainly were, given where it has ultimately led us." "Nor would I." Serafina turned to look at him, studying the face that had once seemed so guarded and unreadable, now open and warm and entirely familiar to her, after a season of shared joys and shared fears alike. "Do you remember what you said to me, that very first night, in the cold study, when I asked why you had agreed to your father's old promise?" "I remember it well." A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. "My father said you required a wife. I told you, and when you pressed me on the matter, I said only that he was right. You said it so plainly, so certainly, that I thought at the time you meant nothing beyond simple duty. I did not yet know that you had chosen me specifically, remembered from a single evening years before, or that hope had quietly guided your father's promise into something far more deliberate than mere obligation." Serafina reached up to touch his face gently, the same gesture she had offered him months before, on the night the ballroom finally reopened after 3 long years of silence. I would ask you again, now, with everything we have learned and everything we have survived together. Was your father right, Gideon? Did you truly require a wife? He caught her hand and pressed a gentle kiss against her palm, his dark eyes warm with an affection that held nothing back any longer, nothing guarded, nothing held in careful reserve against the risk of future grief. He was right, Gideon said softly, echoing his own words from that first cold night, though every trace of distance had long since vanished from his voice. I did require a wife, Seraphina. I required someone who could walk into a house full of silence and old grief and coax it, patiently and fearlessly, back into life again. I required someone brave enough to read my father's promise as an invitation rather than a sentence, and generous enough to offer her heart to a man who had nearly forgotten how to open his own in return. He paused, drawing her closer, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened further still, carrying a certainty that seemed to settle over the quiet conservatory like the last warm light of the setting sun. My father was right that I required a wife. But he could never have known, when he first made that promise so many years ago, exactly how deeply I would come to require you specifically, and no one else. Not merely a wife, Seraphina, but you, entirely and completely, in every way a man might hope to need the woman who has become his whole heart. Seraphina felt tears rise, warm and grateful rather than fearful, and she leaned forward to press her lips gently against his, sealing a promise that had begun in obligation and old debts, but which had grown, through patience and honesty and the slow, steady courage of two careful hearts, into something neither duty nor grief could ever fully explain. Outside the conservatory's glass walls, the gardens of Crowmoor Hall bloomed wildly and beautifully in the golden light of early spring, tended by patient hands that had learned, together, how to coax life back into places long abandoned to silence. And within those old stone walls, the house that had once held its breath for 3 long years, now breathed easily again, full of warmth and laughter, and the quiet, certain happiness of a promise that had, against every reasonable expectation, become a love story, worth every difficult step of the road that led them there. Lord Ashworth, watching from the doorway of the conservatory, unnoticed by either his daughter or her husband in their quiet, private moment, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile before turning away to leave them to their happiness, content at last in the knowledge that the promise he had honored so many years before had led his daughter exactly where she was always meant to be.